opinion makers organized by the Indian Express Group. Today at E-Adda, our guest is Fareed Zakaria, familiar to us not only as the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN, but also as one of our sharpest political analysts and a best-selling writer. His most recent book is 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, which released in October last year, and in which he's written about how the world has changed in response to COVID and how we need to prepare ourselves to meet the new challenges that have already begun to come up on every conceivable front. Mr. Zakaria will be in conversation today with Anant Goenka, Executive Director, the Indian Express Group, and Vandita Mishra, National Opinion Editor, the Indian Express. Before beginning the session, I would like to thank our associate partners, MIDC, Runwal Gardens, and FRR Immigration. May I also request the audience to please put any comments and questions you might have in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Pooja. Ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to the Express Adda. We all know Fareed so well, I have to say his latest book is really a fantastic read. It was a completely addictive experience for me to go through. I went through it and it took me 3 days, and I've absolutely enjoyed every bit of it. He spent a lot of time talking about how we've designed our lives to be both fast and open. How the world is designed to be both fast and open, which just makes all of this by definition a little bit unstable. And so I think this book is a great guide that sort of he's put out there to try to make sense of the world, because as he says, it is likely to remain an unstable world. And I think we'll definitely go into the book and get into some detail, but Fareed, before we get started on the book, we must start with the US. There are two schools of thought about Trump. We're 1 week away from inauguration. One school of thought says that the Republican Party can finally flush Trump from themselves and liberate themselves from Trump, and the Trump era is over. And there's another school of thought that says that, look, his base is activated like always, in fact, stronger than ever, and that Trump is going to be a lasting force in American politics. What do you think? Can we turn our backs and can we see that Trump is behind us, or do we have to keep looking for more?
First, Anand, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure and actually an honor, because I've always loved the Indian Express, and I think the Indian Express plays a very important role in India, both in terms of maintaining a very high level of quality, in many ways, and often is the best newspaper in India, but also in maintaining a high degree of independence, and functioning the way a newspaper should in a democracy, which unfortunately does not happen in India enough. So I just want to first begin by saying
thank you for that.
I'm delighted to be doing this under your auspices and under the auspices of the Express Group.
Thank you.
Look, the way I would put it is this. The good news that is coming out of Washington right now, and I realize it is difficult to discern that there's good news here. Winston Churchill, when he lost the election of 1945, woke up in the morning, saw the newspapers. His wife says to him, darling, this is a blessing in disguise. And he looks at her and says, well, at the moment, it is rather effectively disguised. So we are, it may seem like that to you, but right. The good news here is that not only has democracy prevailed, because keep in mind, it is not just one thing or the other. It is that in 60 court cases, every challenge that Trump brought was turned down, including by judges appointed by him, including by a Supreme Court where conservatives have a very large majority now. It was then turned down by Pence, his own vice president, whom he urged repeatedly to overturn the elections. And then it was overturned, it was held up by the Congress, including the Senate, with a very strong Republican majority at the time, including a majority leader, Mitch McConnell, who was very powerful. All of them blocked his efforts. So there is that very good news there. You're asking the central question, which is what comes after. My own view is there's another piece of good news here, which is I think finally you are seeing a break in the Republican Party. You are seeing people willing to to find a way to separate themselves from him. The problem is that what you described is going to be very difficult, which is option one, because the base is still with Trump. I mean, this may seem fantastical and it may seem unbelievable, but it is basically true that something in the range of 60 to 70% of Republicans still believe that Trump is right. The election was stolen. You're talking about, 50 to 60 million Americans. Part of it is that they've been fed a steady diet of lies for the last 6 months. Remember, Trump began this conspiracy theory a long time ago. So the challenge will be for the party, how do you disassociate yourself from Trump without disassociating yourself from the base and the energy and the intensity of support that comes with it? So my own sense is, here's what's going to happen. The Republican Party is going to break, and it will fracture. There will be a Trump-led, very large segment of populist nationalist types, and there will be a smaller group that will be more of the traditional Republican agenda, low taxes, less government, less regulation, all that kind of thing. It may not happen formally within the party. There may not be two parties, but there will be these fights over every nomination, you can see it. Look, McConnell has broken with Trump. Pence has sort of broken with Trump. Kevin McCarthy, the number one guy in the House of Representatives, is for Trump, but his number three person, Liz Cheney, the daughter of Vice President Dick Cheney, has said she will vote for impeachment. So, you see what I'm saying is in the leadership, you're seeing cracks. And, one of the things we know from, I know this is not exactly the same, but in any dictatorship, you know that things are getting bad when you see division and dissension at the top. So I think you're beginning to see that. And look, you may end up with a new party system in America. You may end up with three parties. You may end up with the Republican Party that is, dominated by Trump, but that is a permanent minority party because they can never, they get 70% of the Republicans, but that's not enough to win a national election. So I think something interesting is happening here. And the reason I say it's good news is this. There are two right-wing ideologies in America. One is a very honorable, ideologically defensible position, small government, low taxes. That's what my friend Van Jones at CNN calls the clean right. Then there is a dirty right. And that dirty right is the right that appeals to people on the basis of race, religion, culture, that plays with these things like fire. And by the way, this will sound familiar to you in an Indian context. There is a clean right and a dirty right. And certainly in America, what you have is these Republican politicians who play both sides, who will dip into the clean right when they're in front of people like you and dip into the dirty right when they're at rallies in their hometown and they're trying to get people to turn out and motivate them using anger and jealousy and envy. So that game has to stop because it's highly destructive. And what you might have is a greater separation where one part of the party is dominated by this dirty right, but then there is a more honorable, clean right as well.
Dr. Zakaria, in 1997, you wrote an essay which turned out to be really influential, and it has been much cited over the years. It was titled "The Rise of Illiberal Democracy," and you pointed to a trend, which was, you said that illiberal democracy is now a growth industry, and that democratic means would be used to undermine democracy. But the countries that you pointed to at that time were, your vantage point was in America, and you were pointing to countries like Philippines, you were pointing to countries like Pakistan, and, you were also talking of Peru and the Palestinian Authority. So America at that time was still the country where you drew up the checklist of democracy, and it was the task of other democracies to either fit the bill or fail to do so. 23 or 24 years later, if you had to write that same essay, what would you write differently? Would you bring America into it now?
So To make so that everyone, the viewers, understand, the point I was making was that it turns out that when we think of democracy, what we really mean is liberal democracy, and there are two elements to a liberal democracy. One is the democratic element, popular participation, vote, elections, but there's another part which is the kind of constitutional element, which is sometimes in a sense called the liberal element, meaning protecting liberty, rule of law, separation of church and state, separation of powers, independence of courts, and that those features were being systematically undermined in a lot of countries that had elected governments. So the elected government was then systematically abusing those rights, and that phenomenon I called illiberal democracy. Now, I did write a book a couple of years later in which I talked about the dangers of illiberal democracy, of creeping illiberalism in the United States. But I have to confess, I did not in any way imagine that we would get to the point we have gotten to in the United States right now. But it's not just the United States. It is happening in other countries that are Western, established. It's happening in places like India. Now, India, I did talk a lot about in the book, because I've always thought that there is a danger of majoritarianism in India, of the majority ruling somewhat arbitrarily and tyrannically. Indira Gandhi, this is one of the great problems we had in the 70s. And of course, it is a problem we have now. I think what the lesson of the deterioration of democracy in America is this. And this is the part I think I didn't adequately understand when I wrote the essay. You can look at systems and say, well, this one is weak because these institutions are new. The courts, independence of the courts is new. The separation of powers is new. They haven't had the time to build. I think what I didn't realize is, institutions they're human. They're fragile by definition. That at the end of the day, an institution is only so strong as the people who are willing to defend it, the people who are willing to uphold it, and that they can shift very easily. I should have realized this, honestly, during the emergency growing up in India, because I think most Indians don't realize what a fluke it is that Indian democracy was not subverted, permanently, because once Indira Gandhi declared emergency, all the elites went along with her, the ones who she did not jail, right? Everybody fell in line. People started treating her like a dictator. Most of the courts fell in line. Most of the newspapers, with the honorable exception of the Indian Express, fell in line. It turned out to be remarkably easy to turn a democracy into something that was close to a dictatorship. Now, in the United States, this did not happen, but I'm not so sure. At some level, it is that the United States, by design, was obsessed with the problem of tyranny. So it has many checks on it. There's Congress and the courts and the president and the independent agencies, and every element of American system is designed to prevent the accumulation of power, which is why it's so hard to get anything done in America. But the central role, again, we went back to individuals. You have to have people of honor and decency, exercising independence, engaging in norm making. So that is what I would fundamentally change. I would say democracy depends on, yes, a well-designed system, institutions, but it also depends on norms, on behavior, on the character of people. And one of the tasks of a democracy is to build those norms. It's one of the things that Nehru did superbly in India. People forget, this is a guy in the 1950s, he had a 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament and a 2/3 majority in 2/3 of the state assemblies. And yet he observed democratic norms to the extent that, he would engage in his own kind of self-criticism. He very famously wrote an anonymous article warning of Nehru's accumulation of power and, tendencies towards dictatorship. And later turned out that the author of that article, anonymously written, was Jawaharlal Nehru himself. So that kind of norm building is something that we have to pay more attention to. Otherwise, you can very easily, with the most beautifully designed constitution, still lapse and still move toward some kind of tyranny.
So whatever form of government and whatever kind of personalities really that emerge in America to lead the government, one thing I think is evident that since Bush at least, there is a fairly bipartisan support for America to make India a significant ally, and the fact that sort of the understanding that the early understanding that Democrats are not good for India, Republicans are good for India, Democrats are pro-Pakistan. That whole theory, I think, is it fair to say that that's out of the window, and that really for India, it doesn't really make a difference beyond a point, sort of who successively in each American election, who kind of gets voted in?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that in the United States, people don't pay enough attention to this because we air our differences in the United States very openly. But there's actually a remarkable degree of bipartisanship in foreign policy. If you take Trump out of it, over the last 30 or 40 years, if you think about policy toward Russia, China, India, the big countries, US policy has been remarkably bipartisan. And as you say, particularly with India, and it has been moving in only one direction, which is closer ties to India. So if you think of the Clinton administration that really began that outreach, then you have the Bush administration, which very critically decides to, in a sense, legitimize India's nuclear program. But there you have to give enormous credit to Manmohan Singh.
Manmohan Singh,
because this was an area where the Bush administration essentially signaled that they wanted India as a close partner and asked, what can we do? What should we? And it was Manmohan Singh who said, the single most important issue for us is that you have to get us out of the nuclear sanctions box. And it was a big ask. You were asking the United States to reverse 30 years of bipartisan foreign policy. And Manmohan Singh, this will go down in history as one of the great turning points for India. Then you have the Obama administration, which even further, closens those, makes those ties closer because of the pivot to Asia. And now you have the Trump administration, which has talked big, but as you know, in practical terms, has actually done very little. My guess is the Biden administration will pick up where Obama left off and continue in substantive ways to do things. The challenge, Anand, is this, which is India hasn't figured out what it wants. In a sense, the United States is an open door. You can push on that door and the answer will be yes, most probably. But what does India want? And in order for India to decide what it wants, it needs to have a strategic conception of its place in the world, its place in Asia, and it doesn't right now. Prime Minister Modi says his policy is, multinational, multi. I can't remember the exact phrase he used, but I'm going to be nice to everybody. Well, that is the opposite of having a foreign policy. Foreign policy is making choices. You have to make strategic choices and orient yourself in a direction, and some people will be happy and some people will be unhappy. I think if India were to decide that it wants a strategic partnership with the United States centered around cooperation and shared information and know-how on technology, energy, education, and defense, that would be a transforming relationship for in India and the United States. But India needs to be much clearer about this. The Indians still remain at the highest level. They still remain ambivalent about that idea of picking sides, aligning with America. There's still a certain amount of the non-aligned mentality that is still part of the Indian foreign ministry. So until it can get rid of those phobias and realize it's actually in a new world, I don't think you'll get as much out of the American relationship as you could.
But the one thing that I think India and China, the Indian America sort of one meeting point really is China. I think American side seems to feel that they need to build a relationship with India primarily to keep China, to check the power of China in Asia and around the world. And I reckon the same thing for India with America is because of this big force of China.
Absolutely. And so the danger for India is that the relationship becomes a narrow defense-oriented relationship that is merely about that issue. Whereas
Right.
what is in India's interest is a broad strategic relationship that helps India to modernize its economy, modernize its educational system,
Yeah.
move to the next frontier in energy. In a way, I would put it this way: India has the opportunity to have the kind of deep country to country, people to people relationship that Britain and the United States had. That is a much deeper kind of strategic alliance than, say, the one that the United States has with Saudi Arabia.
Right.
That's a state to state relationship. What India can achieve is a society to society relationship, much deeper, much stronger. And the reason is obvious: both are open, messy, democratic systems. Both understand each other in that sense. Americans don't understand these black box dictatorships like the Chinese government. Who is making the decisions? How do they get made? That's it. All emanates on. You have to look at smoke coming out of the chimney to figure it out. India is open, messy, chaotic, diverse. Americans understand that kind of system.
Yeah.
That is the system they have, and so there is an opportunity here for a much deeper relationship.
Right.
If I could get you back to the subject of democracy and the pandemic. So, historians tell us that major pandemics often coincide with religious and political contagions. And the historian Niall Ferguson has drawn a link between what happened on January 6th and the fact that, in that roughly at the same time, America was witnessing perhaps the peak of its third COVID spurt. So, do you see a link between the two? Do you see a link between, we could call it political lunacy and the contagion, the pandemic?
Look, what it does is, what I say in the book is, I quote this line of Lenin's: there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. The pandemic has sort of put life on fast forward. It's accelerated many trends taking place around the world, within our system. And so in that sense, what it has done is it has intensified everything that's happening. Now, if you look at this election, the election actually in the United States was a heroic achievement. You had real pandemic with real lockdown, social distancing, masks taking place everywhere. And yet we have had a record turnout and the largest participation by Americans in percentage terms and absolute terms, I think in 100 years. So it was a kind of heroic achievement to get that. But what it did was it has raised the stakes, it has heightened the intensity, it has made people feel that this is a make or break moment. And when those kind of things happen, everybody gets, the atmosphere gets charged in all directions. So I think that's the sense in which I would say the pandemic, I think had an effect. It has something to do with the Black Lives Matter protests that happened. Again, this feeling of intensification and high stakes. It has something to do with the challenges to democracy because the election became a high stakes game. But I wouldn't discount the reality of Donald Trump. I mean, Trump is not produced by the pandemic. He precedes it. And I think it's important to understand how significant a figure Donald Trump is. He really is a break with 70 years of American politics. You've had people like this in the past, Huey Long, McCarthy, but they've never been able to be elected president. There was a limitation to what, this kind of right-wing nationalist populism. The fact that Trump was able to get elected by a kind of a fluke, remember he loses the national vote by 3 million. But the fact that Trump was able to get elected, that had a significant amount to do with the events of January 6th.
But
Go ahead.
Yeah, but Dr. Zakaria, do you not worry that Trump-centric explanations of what happened on January 6th could also lead to Trump-centric, formulations of the calls of accountability? Do you not worry that this would let go of the other complicities in the Trump phenomena, the larger complicities, the fact that the political party, the Congress, the intermediary institutions, including the media, let Trump happen, or that contributed to Trump happening?
No, in fact, I think it actually points to exactly that worry. In other words, I feel like the pandemic lets us all off the hook. You know, if you say, well, it was because of some once in a century pandemic that this happened. No, a lot of it was because right-wing populism and right-wing nationalism grew and grew and was accommodated by the Republican Party in exactly this way of saying the game they play with the clean right and the dirty right. Parts of the media absolutely turned into just amplification mechanisms and loudspeakers for Trump, and more importantly, created a kind of ecosystem in which people really never got the truth. And so with these election frauds, I think one of the central things people need to understand is that the most egregious attack on democracy was not the attack of a few thousand people who stormed the Capitol and tried to enter the United States Congress. The most egregious attack on democracy was the fact that the President of the United States, 150 members of the Republican Party in Congress and at the House of Representatives and the Senate did vote, and in the President's case were urging the overthrowing of a democratically elected government. After all, that was what the vote was. If you are voting to say we are not going to recognize the results of an election that was certified by 50 states and reaffirmed by 60 court decisions, what you are trying to do is overturn an elected government. I mean, that is the definition of a coup, an insurrection, or whatever. They were just using legal means to do it, or quasi-legal means to do it, because actually Congress does not have the authority. That is the sedition, that is the insurrection that matters. And my fear is actually that if we just talk about a pandemic and things like that, people forget human beings were responsible for this. They decided to take these actions because they were weak and cowardly and wanted to pander to what they saw as their political base. And it's as important, I think it's much more important. The writer Ezra Klein has made this point. We should not just punish the weak using legal mechanisms, all those people who stormed the Capitol, and let the strong, the politicians who voted for the same thing, let them go scot-free because they're politicians and they're political class. They should also be held accountable.
So, actually, I think it's a great segue for me to just bring up, my favorite chapter of the book, Fareed, which is, this chapter where you say that people must listen to experts and experts must listen to people. I'm just going to take a small detour, take you back into 2012. You were our guest at the Express E-Adda in Delhi. I don't know whether you remember this. And
I remember it well.
And you probably won't remember that I got the mic for the last question from the audience. And at that time, I think you were editor at large of Time magazine, and Modi was on the cover of Time magazine, and it was the first time an international publication at that point, had given Modi had spoken about Modi as possibly emerging as a national figure in India. And I remember I had asked you, what do you think of that cover? And you completely disowned that cover at that time. You said, it was a big mistake by Time, in that that you were very convinced at that time that Modi wouldn't even remain as a state leader, much less a national one. You have called a lot right. You made a lot of predictions. A lot of them have been right, including the fact that Trump would have lost this election. But something about experts, right? We understand that. We understand why people may not want to listen to experts. People want to listen to people who they just, they want to listen to people who they kind of agree with, and they want to listen to experts who will just tell them, will predict stuff for them, and tell them how to make more money or whatever. But what do you think? What do you think is the reason that experts actually tend not to listen to people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, let me own up to that mistake. You're absolutely right. I said, I think something like he's a regional leader. There's no evidence that he'll be able to become a national leader. Yeah. And look, let me be clear. I was 100% wrong, but so was Atal Bihari Vajpayee.
So were so many experts in India. in
Right.
India.
So my thesis at the time was that Modi was trying to become a regional leader, but that the BJP was a powerful hierarchical organization, and that since Vajpayee and Advani did not want him, as you remember, Vajpayee despised him, that they would effectively keep him at the regional level. I turned out to be dead wrong. I think I misunderstood the degree to which the BJP had actually changed, and there was a lot of grassroots activity. It's actually a very similar phenomenon to what happened to the Republican Party in the United States, which is that this bottom-up fervor of populism and nationalism dislodged what the kind of elites in the capital wanted to happen. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's a very good reminder that elites also need to be much more careful about understanding what is going on, how it's happening and such. And the broader point I was making in that chapter, of course, is that the reason this is a particularly dangerous trend is because we have this big and growing divide in almost every society between an urban, educated, somewhat richer group on the one hand, and a rural, less educated, somewhat poorer group. And I say somewhat because it varies in country to country. It's not only about money. It's really about a sense of class difference, class resentment, class anxiety. And unless we are careful about this, we will create a permanent politics of resentment and grievance, which can then be used very effectively by skillful politicians. Modi uses it in India, Erdogan uses it in Turkey, Putin uses it in Russia, and of course Trump uses it in the United States. So those of us who are living in cities, more educated, who claim to have expertise, have to recognize we sometimes get things wrong. What I always try to do is I try to explain my reasons and the fact base that I use to come to conclusions. As you say, I've been lucky to be right in a number of cases. Of course, I've made mistakes. And the best thing you can do is to try to explain why you come to the position you do, explain how it's based on a fact pattern. And either people will disagree with the fact pattern or dispute it or dispute your reasoning. But to do it also with some measure of humility, some measure of, even with the COVID, the kind of arrogant certainty with which medical experts started out saying things and then contradicted themselves and then reversed themselves and claimed to be experts on things that they don't know. I mean, a doctor cannot understand the impact of a lockdown on the economy, on society, even on health. You have to have other people involved. It can't just be doctors running the country. You have to have economists and urban experts and people explaining, well, what would the effects of a partial lockdown versus a full lockdown be, right? So we need to hear from everyone, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes. And I think, and I love that part when you mentioned in the book about the idea of experts needing to, remember the humility of that perspective. And, I feel whether it's economists, whether it is journalists, whether it is academics, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of, efforts to delegitimize intelligent opinions and ideas. What do you think, is there that one large lesson that you could give, all the experts who are, at Adda today and, people who kind of, we are sort of engaging with constantly as a national news organization? What's that one lesson you could give, from Trump to these people?
Probably the one lesson would be, remember that, sometimes what people forget more than anything else is that human beings want dignity. They want a sense of recognition. So it's not just about economics. I think a lot of people on the left, let's say, broadly speaking, think, look, our programs are going to help these poor people. Why don't they support us more strongly? And what Trump makes you realize is, a lot of his programs help the millionaire class, the corporate tax cuts, the things like that. But he still has this incredible support among the working class. Why? Because he speaks to them with dignity. He gives them dignity. He recognizes them. He doesn't look down to them. He doesn't disdain them. And that feeling that I see you, I hear you, turns out to be very, very important for people's emotional and psychic well-being. The last Democrat who was able to do that really effectively was Bill Clinton. You know, and it's not an accident that Bill Clinton came from the white working class, in a sense. You know, he grew up in modest means in a small town in Arkansas. You know, it maybe gave him naturally an understanding of how to connect. But that, you know, that sense of how to connect with people, how to make them feel honored, with, you know, not about the programs you're doing, because most people, I guess the other way I'd put it is, most people don't vote from their head; they vote from their heart, their gut. You know, it's a different. It's a way of making people feel seen, heard, honored, respected. Not about technical evaluation of your, you know, your particular subsidy scheme or tax scheme or anything like that. Most people subcontract that to you. They say, if I trust you, I'm going to trust you're going to look after me. But do I trust that you really respect me? Do I trust that you get me? You know, that's the association we have to find a way to make.
Right.
Zakaria, if I could draw you out a little on the challenge for journalism today, because you know, it is situated amidst at least two big challenges. One, that there are populists who are trying to draw a direct connection between popular passion and policy, and they are trying to squeeze, you know, the ground for the intermediary institutions. And on the other side, you have this waning of trust in a shared good, in a sense of a common good. And that waning of trust is, of course, you know, exaggerated and exacerbated, made worse by the inequality that we see, which is growing, which makes us all locked into separate and unequal worlds. So in a situation like this, where your ground is being squeezed out by the political populist, and there is lack of trust among the people for the intermediary institution, what is the challenge for journalism? How do they go forward from here?
Boy, that is a very difficult question, and I'm not sure I have an easy answer. My guess is the two of you have thought about this a great deal as well. Look, I think there's no going back to the old world, right? The old world was one where you had limited supply, and the limited supply created, certain, gave a shape to journalism in those days. So in the United States, it meant there were 3 networks. You got all your news from those networks, 4 or 5 big national papers. And the most important thing about those networks was they knew they had a mixture of people, and Democrats, Republicans, left, right. But most importantly, they had a lot of people who were not very political, right? And so they had to provide a kind of centrist, fact-based diet of news. The shift that's taken place is twofold. One, you've lost that cartel that was able to just feed people what it thought was the important thing, and you have now many different platforms of various kinds. But the second is that a large number of the people who were listening, watching, reading in the old days, out of a sense of obligation, out of a sense of limited supply, they actually turn out not to be that interested in politics. You know, so what happens is now the political journalism has to contend with the reality that they are only getting the junkies. They are only getting the groupies. So, you know, in a newspaper, a lot of people would subscribe to the newspaper because mainly what they wanted was the sports news or the cartoons or the cooking recipes or whatever it was, right? But those things are now easily obtainable through the internet. So the people who are reading the newspaper, watching those TV news shows, they are political junkies, and those tend to be more partisan. Those tend to be more deeply engaged, which means they're picking sides. They don't want to just hear the news. So I guess one lesson I would say is you can't escape that. You are going, you are in your universe of people are partisans, and you will have to a certain extent pick, broadly speaking, a side. The challenge, in my view, is that you have to still maintain your standards. You still have to try to provide the best fact-based journalism. And I think there will be a room for quality to shine. So you look at the New York Times. There's no question it has become more liberal over the years, as you know, this process I was just describing has happened. There's a sorting, you know. The New York Times, one of the most successful parts of the New York Times is the New York Times cooking app and the crossword app. But the key thing there is the people who like New York Times for the cooking and the crossword now have their self-contained apps that they can do. They don't have to look at the news anymore. The people who are reading the news are dedicated, committed political junkies who tend to skew more left-wing. But the Times has maintained a very high tradition of great foreign reporting, of, you know, great detailed national coverage, of very, very good election analysis using data and things like that, you know, the various things that they do in the upshot section. So I think that should be the Express's ambition, which is you can't get away from the fact that you are engaging with a more partisan audience. And you have to recognize that will color some of the, you know, the way the Express comes across. But you can still move up the quality ladder and become the gatekeeper and the standard bearer and the premium product. That's how I would look at it. I think that the challenge in terms of profitability and such, you know, is a slightly separate discussion. But again, I think at the end of the day, quality matters a lot, because you know, one of the things you're trying to do is figure out how do you get people to pay for a product in whatever way you do, and you have to be distinctive. If what you have is commoditized, it's very hard to you know, it's very hard to have pricing power on a commoditized product.
But you know, it's interesting because you're talking about audiences getting more and more polarized, especially consumers of news getting more and more polarized. But what we learned from your book is that you know, it doesn't matter that this idea of left and right. Firstly, you know, is, you've said, fairly becoming obsolete, and secondly, it doesn't really matter which government has been left or right. It's, you know, how they've responded to the pandemic. There's no trend in terms of ideology that shows who has responded well or who's responded poorly. It's just literally been a question about how good that the actual governance has been. If I can ask you to talk a bit about that sort of.
Sure. Yeah. So you know, one of the things that I noticed is that and I'm beginning to think about this actually as a research project for myself, which is the 20th century is really marked by this big debate. How big is your government? You know, should you have a big all-encompassing government that owns the commanding heights of the economy, or should you have a small limited government that allows the private sector to dominate the economy? And that debate, which was basically socialism versus capitalism, dominated the 20th century. And we still continue to think in those terms, even though the Cold War is over, communism has collapsed, socialism in that sense has collapsed. But the reality is that all governments now, you know, around the world, actually have a very large role for the private sector, but there's still a large role for government. You know, there is a kind of new equilibrium that has set in. The real challenge is the quality of government, not the quantity of government. Yes. That turns out to be the crucial dimension, which is, do you have bureaucracies that function independently? Do you have a system by which you train, support, promote these people? Do you give them autonomy so that they can engage? Are they non-corrupt? One of the most important factors, it seems to me, when you look at the places, particularly in the less poor, in the less rich countries, where they succeeded, Vietnam, for example, is that the bureaucracies have developed a reputation for being less corrupt. Why is that important? It gets back to the issue of trust. If these bureaucracies are seen as rapacious, predatory, and only, you know, the only reason they exist is to milk people for bribes, then when they issue a guidance, when they issue you're not going to take it seriously. Whereas when the Singapore government issues a decree, people know at the end of the day, these are clean. This is a clean agency, a clean government, and they follow it and they believe in it and they adhere to it. So it turns out that the quality of government matters, the way you structure these groups matters. Places like Taiwan and Singapore operate their bureaucracies actually on small budgets. They do not have the vast scale and scope of certainly Western countries. But I bet you if you were to look at Indian railways, Indian Railways probably has a larger bureaucracy than the entire government of Singapore. But they are well run, the Singaporean government. It's not size, it's quality.
Right.
Dr. Zakaria, when we talk of trust and we talk of intermediary and countervailing institutions in a time when populism is on the rise, the political party, the institution of the political party, I would like to draw you out on. In America, as the imperial presidency took shape, you saw a waning of trust in the party structure, and you see it far more in India. So when you look at India, for instance, you would see that right now you have a kind of a waning in the opposition space. The political party as an institution, as an intermediary institution, is slipping. The trust in it is eroding. What do you see as the way out for the political party? What does the political party have to do in a time of populism to regain itself?
Great question. So first, to explain to people why it's so important, political parties are so important, because the parties are the mechanism by which popular passion is translated into policy. The parties are the mechanism by which you take the somewhat vague, inchoate demands of the public and channel them into a productive platform that says, okay, these are your concerns, so these are the 3 policies we'll come up with, rather than just, kind of reflecting a series of emotional outbursts, which is often the way that the electorate expresses itself. So parties have always played that role of reconciling differences within, a population, channeling passion into policy. Those mechanisms which moderate and also stabilize the political system have traditionally been done through political parties. The problem, as you say, has become that with the rise of, it's also not just populism, but a kind of democratization, where everybody thinks that these elites are bad, party elites are bad. Why should they be making the choices? Why shouldn't the people decide everything? So when you moved into that world, it becomes very difficult for parties to play that stabilizing role, and to play that role as gatekeepers. I pointed out that there have been populists in the past in the United States who have been quite dangerous. Huey Long, Father Coughlin, McCarthy, and they don't become president largely because the party intervened in some way to place a kind of limit or a check on them. And this is, by the way, happened in India more dramatically, as you point out. So to me, the single most important event in that respect was what happened, I think it was in 1971. Indira Gandhi suspended internal party elections in the Congress party. So before that, the Congress party was a very vibrant, bottoms-up grassroots organization that produced a lot of local leaders from the bottom who then came up through the states and became powerful. So, if you looked at somebody like Kamraj in the South, if you looked at somebody like Y.B. Chavan in Maharashtra, these were all people with deep reservoirs of local support who then moved up through the party structure. So the party was highly representative. So it was able to be a moderating force, but it had the legitimacy that came from being representative. When Indira Gandhi suspends internal party elections, what that does is basically turns the Congress party from a grassroots organization into a court. Now, every ticket for every seat, not just in the national parliament in Delhi, even the state legislators, was granted from Delhi. So what that meant is the game politically was no longer to build a base in your home state, to build a base in your local area, but to go and act like a courtier in Delhi, to sit outside the offices of the secretary to the secretary to the secretary to the secretary of the prime minister. The two most powerful people in India at the time became Session and Dhawan, the two gatekeepers to the prime minister's schedule. That is a total distortion of the democratic process. Something similar, interestingly, is now happening to the BJP, which has become essentially a one-person organization, or maybe a three-person organization. And so there's a danger there as well. As you point out, the Congress has never really recovered from that period, and has essentially been a series of courts that have been dominated by one family. So it's easy to say what should be done. These parties need to be more grassroots oriented. They need to be more responsive, because then you can play a gatekeeping role. Then you can play a moderating role. If you are a court, it's very hard to do. Even for the BJP, it'll turn out. Look, Modi has an uncanny ability and a very good sense of what people want. But will his successor, right? Will the next person who runs the BJP, if he or she has all the same powers that Modi does, the same almost dictatorial control, will that person have the same level of skill to know and read and manipulate public opinion? I don't know. So the task is to really emphasize the degree to which the parties, it's a variation of the point Anant and I were discussing about elites listening to people. If you want to guide and if you want to lead, you also have to take care to maintain a very close connection to the base, maintain a close connection to the rank and file, to the grassroots, which in India has happened much less than it should. The one thing I'll say about the Indian party system is, at a local level, the saving grace is that a lot of these states have local or regional parties which are relatively strong. So while at the national level you have increasingly two court-like parties, at the local level many of these parties are strong. And my suspicion is the challenge to the BJP will not come from right now from Congress, the other national party, but it will come from a series of local parties, regional parties in the South, which, by the way, is the way the first challenge to the Congress party came in the 1960s. It was it was Southern parties, Nijlingappa, people like that, challenging the Congress on linguistic issues, which might themselves play a role in the challenge to the BJP.
I think we'll try to do two more questions before we open up to the audience, because it's really a packed house. I'm not surprised, and some incredibly I'm sure bright questions that'll come at you. I want to talk about two things, and I'll try to get through both. One is this unprecedented sort of concentration of power with a few corporations in each country around the world. If you look, in the American context, especially with big tech, I want to, is it even reasonable to expect that any government can be big enough to regulate big tech anymore? If you, just a small, even after Capitol Hill, and there are views about how strongly big tech reacted. But instead of a precedent, regulating tech, you had literally, Twitter and Facebook and Amazon regulating the president in a sense, right? Obviously he's an outgoing president, etc. But that kind of power of just being able to literally blow a precedent out of the public discourse really overnight, on the turn of a dime. Isn't this uncharted waters we're getting into?
It's no question. It's absolutely uncharted waters, and part of it is, look, there is a structural reality here, which is that between the information revolution and globalization, but mostly it is technology that is driving us toward these single platforms, which means that these single companies have enormous power. Yeah. Right? You have the extraordinary reality, and it's impossible to imagine another market like this, right? Where you look at search, and Google's market share is between 80 and 95%, depending on the country you look
Absolutely.
at. You look at Amazon, and you can't even easily come. In India you can, but in most places there is no number two player.
Yes.
and the pandemic has actually accentuated that reality, because the whole, we all want to be on the platform everybody else is on.
Yes.
Because that's the nature of a digital space, that there are huge advantages to being on the same platform that everyone else is on. That's what people call network effects. So that network effect is so powerful, but it means that one company dominates. And the reason I make this point is because I don't know how easy it is going to be to regulate it. I'm sure about one thing, which is that the market is not going to provide a solution to this.
Yes.
I think people who think that the market is going to provide a solution misunderstand the problem. The market has found a solution to what it has. Markets solve for inefficiency.
Yes.
This is a super efficient system, right? I mean, you are getting all the benefits of the fact that everyone else is on this platform, which means that you have massive, maximum access, maximum ease of use, lowest cost of transaction, but it is creating a monopoly. So the only way around this is politics. So the government has to find some way to regulate. But even that is not going to be that easy. So I'm not sure. So you break up, you separate YouTube from Google. I'm not sure what that would do. Probably the shareholders of Google would make money, because then both would rise. There'd be certain kind of a unlocked value that goes up. It was after they broke up Standard Oil that John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world, because the 7 companies that were created all rose in market value over the years, and that made him even richer than he was before. So I think that there needs to be some intelligent regulation of these spaces. I do think that you cannot leave it just to the economic space. And you're right, it's happening in every country. But it is all the more reason to try to come up with some intelligent set of regulation. Look, in the old days, monopoly used to be thought of as something where
less than 20%.
The private company had too much power.
Yes.
It was defined somewhat vaguely. In the 70s, with the market revolution, what happened is people started to think, the only measure is, does the consumer get a lower price? If the consumer gets a lower price, it's not a monopoly. And then by that definition, of course, all these tech companies are not monopolies, because the consumer gets the product for free. But that can't be the definition. You are creating massive concentrations of power. You have the inability of smaller companies to compete, the inability of smaller companies to even bargain on reasonably fair terms with these large behemoths. So in every broader sense, these companies are monopolies. But it is true that the consumer gets a free good. But that can't be the sole criteria. So that is, I think, where the basic intellectual unwinding has to happen. We have to realize the consumer price is just one measure of whether you have too much concentration of power. And it is the role of the government to try to place limitations, because you do want a more open, more diverse system where small companies can rise, where these companies don't have too much political power. By the way, the Twitter ban on Trump, to my mind, is completely egregious. I mean, I don't think it's a good idea. And I don't think it's a good idea to ever ban somebody for life like that, permanent ban. If you look at their criteria, it makes no sense, because they have other people who incite hatred and even violence. I mean, you have Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran, who has 7 Twitter accounts in 7 different languages, and the president of the United States doesn't. What sense does that make?
And our corporations now becoming, somehow, strategic assets for countries. When do they begin to be part of the arsenal of things, arsenal of assets that they kind of negotiate with?
It's already happening to a certain extent. We are moving to a less, free market era, one of greater sense of kind of strategic national competition. I think within limits, some of that is reasonable. Particularly in the technology space, you want to make sure that you do not feel technologically vulnerable to 1 or 2 countries and things like that. But my fear is that this stuff will be taken too far. My fear is that it will be used by governments to play favorites. the thing to remember about all these kind of strategic national economic policies is it all sounds good in theory. But what actually happens is what every Indian knows, which is that the government isn't making some wise strategic national decision. They're favoring companies that pay them off. They're favoring companies with whom they have strong, close relationships. And that happens it's not just India, it happens everywhere. And so the danger is that this system becomes highly corrupt, manipulated very, very easily and very quickly. And so I would much prefer to see a much greater degree of restraint from governments here. It's easy to gin up support for a policy when you say, oh, we have to compete against the Chinese. We have to make sure the Chinese don't dominate this, that, and the other. And as I say, within certain limits that makes a sense, but much of that is a cover for the ability for governments to just support the people who are paying them off, support people they are politically inclined to support, and ultimately support a lot of inefficiency and monopoly.
Yes. I think we must go to audience. Vandita, we have a lot of questions coming in. Can I start with Shashi Tharoor, please?
Yeah,
Shashi,
sure.
Hi, Fareed. Very good to see you and listen to you, and Anant and Vandita as well. It's been a stimulating discussion. I do have a question for you, but if I may make a brief comment on the last exchange you had with Anant on
please
social media companies. You're right, and indeed, in our Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, the issue has come up. But don't forget that at the same time, there's been a lot of public criticism of these companies for not calling out politicians when they make egregious claims. I think you'll remember the famous attacks on Mark Zuckerberg by a whole series of people that got a lot of attention a few months ago, because he was essentially taking the position, as they put it, that anyone could say any lie on Facebook and get away with it because Facebook didn't take any responsibility for policing content. Now that they're actually doing something, the social media companies are under the cosh. So it's not an easy dilemma to resolve. But that's just a comment because the discussion, I'm sure, on this issue can go on much longer. I wanted to take you back in my question to an earlier book more than a decade ago, in which you had written about the fact that what we were seeing in the world was not the decline of the West, but the rise of the rest. And I'm just curious if I can get you to revisit this, a dozen years down the road, because the West has been through all the convulsions since then. It's seen the rise of strongmen rulers, some of whom are fairly undemocratic, and some of whom have been anti-democratic, as you could rightly argue about Mr. Trump and his cohort in Washington. And at the same time, when you speak of the rise of the rest, it's essentially been, for the most part, the rise of China. Yes, some of the smaller Asian countries, perhaps one or two other countries that weren't amongst the risen have risen a bit now. But essentially, are we seeing a complete change in the global equation? Whereas you were writing at a time of a robust, democratic, economically prosperous West, suddenly have to deal with a rising series of equally economically prosperous emerging markets. You're now looking at a very different world in which that paradigm perhaps arguably no longer applies, and that the post-American world you wrote about will actually see a diminished America, a risen China, and a whole set of new values to look at in this area.
Well, as always with Shashi, everything he says is intelligent. So let me start with just a comment on his comment about the social media companies. Look, I agree, it's a very tough challenge. If you don't do it, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. I would only add to the complexity of the challenge this hypothetical. Imagine that it is not Mark Zuckerberg who would be determining what can appear on Facebook and not, but Rupert Murdoch. In other words, would you be comfortable with one individual deciding what was going to be? I think I would be more comfortable with the democratic political system that provides certain guidelines which all these companies have to follow, and and it has to navigate doing that around freedom of speech issues. But you can do it because there are licenses involved and there are regulations involved. So that's the direction I'm more comfortable with, rather than hoping that Mark Zuckerberg will do the right thing. But that's just a comment, and to agree entirely with Shashi's point that it's a very difficult challenge. On your main point, I think you're absolutely right. What you have seen is a less of a rise of the rest than I would have expected, but I think it still has altered the international system substantially. So without any question, China is the big story. Now the second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest economy in the world. But let me give you one example to show you what I mean by how the world has changed. You look at Turkey 35 years ago, when the United States wanted Turkey to do something. The Pentagon would literally just tell the Turkish government, which was run by generals, and the generals would say, how high do you need us to jump? And they would jump. Now you have 3 decades of economic growth. You have a consolidated new political system that is, I would describe as quasi-democratic, but fairly stable. You have the arrogance or cultural confidence that comes from 30 years of economic growth. Per capita GDP in Turkey has quadrupled, almost quintupled. And so what you find is a Turkey that will not listen to Washington on almost any issue. A Turkish foreign policy that is entirely independent. It may be, by the way, often quite self-defeating. It might be, kind of has its own problems, but they are certainly no longer willing to play the game of being pawns in a larger chessboard with the great powers acting. And that is the way in which the world has changed. It has become, and Turkey is not unusual. Brazil has become more like that. Obviously, India always was like that, but has become more so. So each of these countries that, while they have not risen quite as much as China, they have changed their character. But what you are referring to is, I think, something that I worry a great deal about, which is whether it's because these countries have risen, whether it's because of the rise of China. One thing that is clear is the post-American world appears to be a less liberal world, we knew it would probably be a somewhat less orderly world, but what is striking is the degree to which it is less liberal. And this is now, I think, the great challenge we face going forward, which is a post-American world, a post-Western world, going to be a post-liberal world? And liberal, again, I mean values that are centered on the preservation of individual liberty and freedom. And here the challenge is this. Do these values, are these values universal values, or are they Western or American values? Are the institutions that were set up after World War II institutions that rest fundamentally on American power, or are they institutions that can be co-opted and continue to function in a world of greater multipolarity, of greater disorder, in which other countries like the Turkeys and Brazils and Indias of the world have a greater say? I worry a lot. Look, I mean, the reason world trade has come to a standstill is, as you know, because India and Brazil in the last in the Doha round killed any further progress. It wasn't China. So it's not just that China is illiberal. It's that other countries are also providing a kind of break on this process. My hope is that you will have a period of tussling and navigation and negotiation, but that over time you will still continue to see a broad acceptance of these universal values and an instantiation of these values around the world. But I'm an optimist. I suspect that Shashi also would hope for that, having worked for so many years at the United Nations. But let's face the reality. It is possible that this entire world order that has been created after 1945 fundamentally rested on American power and American values, maybe Western power and Western values. And, it could crack and fissure very easily. Again, back to our discussion of democracy, a lot will depend on what we do. This is not a machine that will work by itself automatically. And if countries decide that they're going to, for their own narrow advantages, stretch and strain and stress the system, it could easily crack.
Can we? Can I ask Mr. Dinesh Trivedi, please, to? Dineshji, are you on? Okay, maybe we can come back to him in a bit. Mr.
Yeah,
Ajit
now it's
Gulati,
okay. I'm unmuted now. Can you
please
hear
go
me?
ahead. Yeah. Yes, I can.
Hi, Fareed. One of the programs which I never miss is the GPS. And I'm glad you mentioned about the railway, and I had the privilege of being the minister there. Having said that, the largest democracy and the oldest democracy, India and America, has a lot in common. And one of the common is knowledge, the hunger for knowledge. And that's why these two democracies have really come together. Now that knowledge, which is turning into a digital dictatorship almost, which has a lot of good points. And what we have seen in the Capitol Hill, to my mind, is just a symptom of a bigger thing which was behind that symptom. And if we just blame an individual, then I think we'll be simplifying a lot of things. So what I'm trying to get at, that people are angry. People are angry, and the world has polarized. Whether polarization in India on account of religion or the Western on account of the color of the skin. Would you agree with me that when we talk about the liberal values of democracy, that spirit of democracy has gone? And in this vacuum, would you say that China would take a lot of advantage of it, and maybe technology, whoever is ahead in the world, will rule the world? Because there is one common thing which I have learned early in my life, that whoever has gold makes the rule. And that is what the golden rule is all about. Thank you.
So you raise a very important point, Ganesh. The first one is, actually several points. So the first one is, what is happening to Western democracy as you have this polarization, which is not just polarization in terms of ideas, but it's polarization around race, religion, color of skin, caste, and creed. And I think that that kind of ethnic, racial, religious division is very dangerous for democracy. And it is one of the reasons why I so admire what Gandhi and Nehru tried to do in India, which was to emphasize the secular character of the country. Because it's not just that it's the right thing to do from point of view of communal harmony and racial reconciliation. It is also the only basis on which you can have a sustainable democratic experiment. Because otherwise, what ends up happening is people move into armed camps, as it were. And you're sort of declaring war on each other, using democracy as the means to wage war. And we saw the outcome of that in Capitol Hill. And there's almost no place in which this has worked out well. So it's even if you look at a place like Belgium today, an advanced, rich country, and you see it when you have at the heart of the division is an ethnic division, it is fundamentally deleterious to your democracy. And by the way, it's not an accident that Belgium has the highest number of COVID deaths per capita in the Western world. It's partly because of the dysfunction, the distrust, the decay that sets in when you have that kind of thing. So I think that to the extent that politicians use and deepen and widen these kinds of divides, they are playing a very dangerous game with democracy itself. Now, to your other point there, what I would say is this. I continue to be something of an optimist that if democracies can get their house in order, if we make some wise choices over the next 10 or 15 years, we will live in a messy, chaotic, but open and somewhat liberal world, and that China will not dominate. And the reason I think this is, at the end of the day, there is a democratic spirit that has an enormous amount of power. It's messy, it's chaotic, but look at all the dictatorships, right? I mean, from the Germany to the Soviet Union to Mao's China to Iran and the Khomeini, they have ultimately never really been able to hold that. So China was able to do so because it essentially opened up a vast part of its society, the economy, and is now trying to play this balancing game where it has a very open economy when it wants productivity and a very closed society, what Nicholas Kristof calls market Leninism. We'll see how stable that is. I mean, that's a very difficult trick to play over the long run. And I think that if you look at China externally, what is striking to me is Xi Jinping's foreign policy has basically been a failure. I mean, what is the goal of your foreign policy? To win friends, to influence people, to set standards around the world. You have a situation where India is now more strongly and stridently anti-Chinese than it was 10 years ago. Vietnam is more strongly, stridently anti-Chinese. The Philippines, which was trying to cozy up to China, possibly because Duterte has been, favored by the Chinese government in various ways. Even they have now committed to joint military exercises with the United States. Australia is becoming more and more anti-Chinese. Japan, and was in that direction. So I'm looking around China and thinking to myself, what neighboring country has it not alienated in the last 5 years? And if it continues down this path, these tendencies will only grow. The Chinese seem to have fundamentally misunderstood their position. They are not the United States, which was growing rich and powerful in an isolated hemisphere with two vast oceans and two weak neighbors surrounding it. China is growing rich and powerful in the middle of a crowded continent, Asia. And if it's not careful to navigate those relationships with its neighbors, it is going to find itself surrounded by a ring of hostile adversaries around it, supported, by the way, by the most powerful country in the world still, the United States of America. That does not strike me as a recipe for strategic dominance of the world. It strikes me as a recipe for a kind of, potentially nasty Cold War, but not one in which China will by any means clearly prevail. So I still tend to think that that China, let's not make the mistake of painting our enemies 10 feet tall. China is navigating its own complexities. It has a huge demographic crisis that it is going to have to address in the next 20 years. It faces this reality of countries increasingly alienated from it. It has many strengths, of course, but in democracies, the United States and India being particular examples, we air our dirty laundry in public very, very conspicuously. So it's very easy to see all the problems. But China has problems too. You just go to jail if you mention any of them on the Chinese media.
But I must ask a follow up, and then we've got a lot of questions to go through. So maybe I'll ask the other questions to come 2 or 3 at a time. Fareed, if you can take 2 or 3 questions at one time. But just to follow up on that, you have made a very interesting point. You said that U.S. Relationship with China is so different from Russia, and you've actually, I thought, said that it's not in America's interest to villainize China beyond a point. Is it possible, is it at all conceivable for India to have a friendly relationship with China?
Yes, the point I was making there was, at the height of the Cold War, the best years of US-Soviet relations, the US and the Soviets did $2 billion of trade every year. Yes. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. Yes. So you are living in a much more connected, interdependent economy. And so we are not going to, that's why it is both my hope, but also my prediction, we will not go down the classic Cold War path because it's in no one's interest. Everyone benefits from having this global economy and having the level of openness and connectivity. In some areas, it will get closed down, particularly around technology and defense. But in other areas, I suspect that Walmart and Amazon will continue to source a lot of their products from China. I suspect China will continue to sell a lot of buy a lot of agricultural products from the United States. So I think that India has to find a way to navigate this. You know, in social media, there's this term frenemy, meaning that you are a friend. That is a useful way to think about relations in this new world, where you're going to have a lot of economic contact with China. There are going to be areas where there are barriers, and there is suspicion, and there is effort to create a containment or deterrence. So call it what you will. And by the way, the Chinese are comfortable with that as well, because that's what China does. I mean, the Chinese do a lot of business with the United States, but they walled off their technology so that Google and Facebook and Amazon were not allowed to enter the Chinese market. You know, so they are perfectly comfortable in a world in which there is some degree of economic cooperation, interdependence, activity, but there are some areas which are walled off.
Right, right. Can I ask Ajit Gulabchand, Chairman of HCC, to ask the next question, and then after him, I'll ask Mr. Ed Ningombam, Head of Marketing and Communication of Google, to ask the question after that. Mr. Gulabchand?
Yes. Fareed, I have two questions for you. One is a little more personal. Why did you leave India? A land of opportunity after independence. You are one of the first few free-born children of this country. And why did you decide to stay away abroad from India? This is one question. The second question is that both America and India, the world's largest democracies, had very different paths after their constitution was formulated. If you see, the First Amendment to the American Constitution gives so many freedoms that are even today respected by everybody, and you seek that protection every day. Whereas the First Amendment to the Indian Constitution was even carried out by the Constituent Assembly and not by a freely elected government or a parliament. So what is it that you found so sexy about Jawaharlal Nehru being a great protector of democratic rights?
Thank you, Mr. Gulabchand. Can I ask Ed to please ask the next question?
So we can move on to the next.
Oh, Ed, okay. Then can I call Pallava Bagla from the New Frontiers in Science and Development?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question, Fareed, is very straightforward. We are having a dialogue between the oldest and the largest democracy, and we saw America turning into a banana republic last week. In this circumstance, do you think India should be sending peacekeepers to secure American nuclear weapons since Trump has his hand on the button?
Should I answer all
yeah,
of
please,
that?
right. You got three questions to answer, so I'll let you.
Yeah. So let me answer the substantive ones first. Look, I think that the important point to make is that America did not turn into a banana republic. As I point out, it's not, you know, if you look at how American checks and balances worked, it's actually quite impressive. You had Republican governors and secretaries of state ratifying an election in which their candidate lost. They then recounted where the recount was mandated by law. They certified it. There were 60 cases that Trump took to the courts. In all 60 cases, he lost. He lost, including with judges whom he had appointed, in some cases, 1 year earlier. It was then sent up to the Supreme Court that twice ruled against him. It then went to the United States Congress, and he tried to get the vice president to use a kind of creative interpretation of his own authority. The vice president issued a legal opinion arguing that he did not have that power under the Constitution. And then the House voted it down and the Senate voted it down, with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican majority leader, saying, this is the most important vote I will cast in my life, which is to not allow this subversion of democracy. I don't think that describes a banana republic. I think that describes a constitutional democracy that was placed under tremendous strain that faced one of the gravest challenges it has ever faced, but ultimately affirmed itself and affirmed its ability to work. Now, obviously, we're all very nervous about the prospect of it not working, and as I say, it depends a lot on character and leadership and norms, but that is the truth of all democracies. You know, the Weimar Constitution was one of the most beautifully designed and written constitutions in the world. But what happened was ultimately a failure of leadership in Germany that allowed Hitler to rise and the Weimar Constitution to be destroyed. On the larger, you know, on the question about American rights and such, look, my point would be, the Indian Constitution is in many ways a very admirable product. I think that you're slightly wrong about the actual sequence, because the Bill of Rights in the United States was also enacted by the first, by America's Constituent Assembly, as it were. Those rights were also ratified almost instantly. So it's not that different. The issue is that the American system found a way to divide power and to put checks and balances in place that have worked remarkably well and required remarkably little tinkering with. Other than if you take the first 10 amendments out, the United States has had essentially 15 or 20 amendments, many of them relating to the Civil War and slavery. If you look at the Indian Constitution, you know, it's had hundreds of amendments since only 1947. But I would not claim one is far superior to the other. Which gets really to the question you were asking, which was personal. I would not claim that my decision to go to the United States and to emigrate to the United States is some kind of great choice between the two political systems or two societies in some grand sense. Look, I'm just one human being who made a very personal choice. When I was growing up in India in the 70s, it was a pretty rough time. I mean, you will remember this was the depth of Indian statism and socialism. Indira Gandhi had nationalized the banks, declared a state of emergency. You had an economy that was utterly stagnant. And to somebody like me, who did not come from any great economic means, my parents didn't own vast industrial house or something like that. They were salaried employees, and as a result, while we were very well situated, and they were very well, you know, they had a very strong connections within Indian society. I did not have any great industrial fortune to worry about. I was looking at it as an individual, and for me personally, I found immensely attractive the idea of the openness, the spirit of adventure, the canvas on which you could paint in the United States. And India seemed a very cramped, difficult, stagnant society at the time. I don't know how I would feel if it were 25 years later and you had all the reforms and India had become as dynamic as it has. But I would also point out I was also living in a much more secular India when I was growing up. I am struck when every time I come back to India, and I always go to not just to Bombay, Delhi and such. My father set up a whole bunch of charities in Aurangabad. So I've been to rural India, and his constituency was 1,000 villages around Aurangabad, the city. So I've seen a lot of it. It's much more communal, much more. The level of tension, antagonism, suspicion, the lack of a commingling is so much greater. When I was growing up, we celebrated Holi, we celebrated Diwali. At our Eid parties, half the people there would be Hindus. We even celebrated Christmas. And this was all done in a very conscious effort to build a kind of national, secular, democratic character to the country. It was very important to my father because my father was, of course, as a very young man, made a choice about whether he was going to go with Jinnah's vision of of religious nationalism or Nehru's vision of a secular democracy. And for him, that choice that he made when he was 13, 14 years old was the most important choice of his life. And his whole life's work was to reaffirm that choice. So, I don't know what it would look like to somebody, to me, growing up in India today. There are pluses and minuses. But the most important point I want to make is, I don't want my personal decision, which is comes from my own, that's one man's choice. And I don't think it says anything bad about India or good about America. It was a particular idiosyncratic choice. I'm comfortable with it, but I don't pretend that it is some kind of ringing affirmation of one society over the other.
We've got a few more questions, Fareed, so I'm just going to ask for then Dr. Shukla, Chief Economist of Mahindra Group, and then if I can ask Mr. Jamal Miklai, and then we'll go with Mr. Yogendra Alag. So if all three of you can please be ready and go one by one. Dr. Shukla, please.
One more lesson of the pandemic should have been, please learn to unmute yourself.
Right, if we don't have Dr. Shukla with us, let's move to Mr. Alag, Yogendra Alag.
Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. You made some very pithy and precise. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So you'll have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Very pithy and precise. My question is, how much damage has the US soft power sustained post-Capitol fiasco? And more importantly, what will it take to salvage it? So will the US have the moral authority to lecture other countries to improve upon their democracies now? Or you think the Rubicon has been crossed?
Okay.
Thank
you.
It, yeah.
Mr. Alag?
Me.
Yes, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
my question is, you've convinced me that I'll spend some of my pension to buy your book, but my question relates more with the Biden presidency and the relationships between India and the United States. I think we are looking at it more from the angle of a more aggressive US contribution in the WTO, and I think that's legitimate. The issues of education and technology that you raised, something like climate change, this means going back to earlier strategy we had of protecting the rights of the native population on forests, Adivasi, Kashmir, and so on. And of course, this is an association. And do you think that some of the emphasis of human rights that was talked about, and India was mentioned in particular, in the president, you see those things be importance in the coming period on the relationship between India and the United States?
Okay, I don't know. I had some trouble hearing that, but did you get it, Fareed?
No, I did not.
Okay,
No,
I think Mr. Alag will just come back to you in a bit. Can I just go to Jamal Miklai? Jamal?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. Fareed, couple of quick questions. You were talking about the New World Order and the US and China and India's role in it. I'm curious, nobody seems to be talking about Europe. To my mind, the social and economic structure in Europe is perfect compared to everything else. Why does nobody see that as the future? And my second question is perhaps a little dicey. Could you, in the old days in school, I'm sure you had compare and contrast. Could you compare and contrast Donald Trump and Narendra Modi? Thank you.
Please go ahead. And then we'll take, we have three more after that and then we'll run.
Your question about Europe is very interesting and important. So I think that the way I would put it is, at some level, Europe is the future to which we should all aspire, right? Europe has found a way to create a vibrant capitalist system that still provides a fair degree of social equity and opportunity to people. It has a functioning safety net that is probably better than any other in the world, while at the same time maintaining a great deal of vitality and dynamism. And it has found a way to solve the oldest problem of international relations, which is to, it has, with a small sacrifice of sovereignty, it has found a way to essentially make war unthinkable in the European context. I mean, think about the dramatic nature of that change. Between 1850 and 1950, France and Germany fought 3 bloody wars, in 2 of which they dragged the rest of the world. And those became world wars. Today, war between France and Germany is unthinkable, right? And so to have achieved that transformation is really extraordinary. The problem is, I think that the forces that produced that transformation were 2 bloody wars that tore Europe apart. 50, 60 million people died, and that is, you are unlikely to reach that level of transformation and that kind of decision to make those kind of sacrifices of sovereignty, for example, without that. On your broader question of why Europe is not a greater model, I think part of it is this. Europe does not act in a sustained strategic manner as one entity. And they talk about it that way. They like to think of themselves doing that. Maybe in trade, they are able to do that in one narrow area. They act with one voice. But by and large, Europe still remains a collection of countries that have agreed to have a degree of common governance, but do not actually have a common government. And that distinction means that they don't project themselves strategically and purposefully on the world stage in quite the same way. The second reason, I think, is Europe in some ways may be, I was saying at some level it's the future, but the reality is that it's the past, by which I mean Europe demographically is simply in decline. Europe is, Italy has become essentially a retirement state. Germany, even though it has arrested it by taking in these immigrants from the Middle East, is on a similar trajectory. You are seeing a very significant demographic slowdown in Europe, which is why you do not see much growth there. You see, a little bit, but not significant. So part of the reason may be the kind of demographic slowdown, which has become part of the kind of inevitable story of Europe. And in that sense, people talk about Europe as a museum. Larry Summers had a great line where he said, the dollar will remain the global currency as long as Europe is a museum, Japan is a retirement home, and China is a prison. So, at the end of the day, you need some standard, and the US provides the only standard. Oh, somebody asked a question about soft power in the US and
yes, sorry.
After the capital. Look, I think it's damaged. There's no question. It's much more awkward for the United States to lecture other countries about democracy. But as I say, one of the ways to interpret what happened here is that the American democracy triumphed and American democracy prevailed. And if I were to approach it, if I were to advise the State Department, I would say, be open, be honest about that. Say, look, we face challenges too. We understand these challenges you're facing. We understand the difficulty. But what we would argue is learn from our mistakes, learn from the successes we had. This is, by the way, why it's very dangerous when the Hungarian government decides that it is going to dispense with the independence of the judiciary. Because one of the things that saved us in the United States was the independence of the judiciary. This is one of the reasons why we should maintain some division of power between the legislative branch and the executive branch. There are ways to present this that are more humble, recognize we all are facing our own demons. And I think that at its best, that has always been the way the United States presented itself, not as this sort of shining city on the hill, but as a country that is grappling with the complexities of freedom, but wishes and is a well-wisher and supporter and aider of all those other countries that are grappling with the problems of democracy as well.
Can I ask Mr. Sanjay Pugalia, editorial director of The Quint, after which I'll ask Mr. Jeetu Punjabi, please, CEO of EM Capital Advisors.
Hi, Mr. Zakaria. Congratulations for your book. It is really a toolkit for people like us. My question is about Trump. What should be done with him? Should he be left alone so he becomes irrelevant? Because if law takes its own course and Democrats go for impeachment, he will crave for that kind of relevance and he will still dominate the political space in America. How should Trump be dealt with?
It's a great question. And I think that ultimately you defeat this kind of force politically, not legally. And so I'd be much more comfortable with what you're hinting at, which is let's try to find a way to fight the phenomenon rather than, imprisoning the person. Now, again, people will remember after the Janata Party came into power, after the emergency, well, I think one of the biggest mistakes they made was to try to criminalize the issue of Indira Gandhi, sending her to jail and things like that. So I worry about that. I think one strategy would be a congressional censure, which might attract a lot of Republican votes and has the advantage of in a sense, sending that signal without, allowing for the drama of a trial and impeachment, and then you rally his base in various ways. But ultimately, you have to hope that what will happen is that the public will grow tired of him, see through him. And I think there will be some court cases that will run their course because, look, over his life and even in the last years, he has engaged in illegal activities. Using your campaign funds to pay hush money to a porn star with whom you had sex is illegal. And, if he has to suffer the legal consequences of that, so be it. So I'm certainly perfectly comfortable with the law taking its course where it should. But politics should be aimed at discrediting him politically rather than criminalizing this activity, even though what he did at some level might be, considered criminal in the incitement to insurrection. That reminds me, I missed one question, which was Trump and Modi. Look, I think that they do have a lot in common. I think that they both are nationalists, both are populists, both are, I think, have certain authoritarian tendencies, is the way I would put it. I think Modi is much more skilled. Modi is a much more skilled, smooth politician. He understands how to play the politics of resentment, of division in a way that is careful, calibrated, signaled. He pulls it back when he needs to. He pushes it when he needs to. And I think he has the advantage, if I may be honest, of a society in which there are fewer barriers and fewer obstacles. And therefore he knows when he has greater reign. Look, you'd have to say that Modi has been much more successful in what he has attempted to do. Partly because he is a bit more skilled politician, but partly because I think at the end of the day, I leave it to you to tell me whether you think Indian courts have been as effective at asserting their independence, whether the Indian media has been as resolute in calling out things that it regards as assaults on democracy or cases where facts are being manipulated, things like that. Whether regional governments have been able to do it. In India, I've been somewhat disappointed by the lack of these intermediary authorities and institutions to push back. I think that's not Modi's skill, that's India's failing.
Mr. Jeetu Punjabi, and then I'll ask Mr. Ashok Khemka, Principal Secretary, Government of Haryana.
Sorry, two questions from me. One,
I'm going to tweak this China aggression, external aggression, with Australia, with India, on the Taiwan issue, on the Hong Kong issue, as a function of Xi Jinping trying to legitimize his existence for life as a leader, rather than a function of China broadly trying to flex its muscles. One, how do you see this play out? And do you kind of think that Xi Jinping succeeds, or do you think there is China in its more normal fashion comes out and takes the lead? The second question is, we meet a lot of leaders all over the place. Are you seeing any rising stars? Are you seeing someone with a lot of promise and a lot of passion who you think will have greater influence on the world over time?
Sure, both great questions. Look, the question you asked about China is in many ways a very difficult, it's a very important and very difficult question to answer. There's no question what you say is right. What you are seeing is in terms of Chinese foreign policy is part of what has been described as the third revolution in China. The first being the Maoist revolution, the second being Deng Xiaoping's revolution, and the third being Xi Jinping's revolution, where he has taken China in a more statist direction economically, in a more repressive direction politically, and in a more expansionist or aggressive direction externally. Will it succeed? I cannot tell you honestly that I can predict that. What I will tell you is right now there does not seem any opposition to Xi Jinping. He has consolidated power dramatically and successfully. It's possible that there will be a fourth revolution. There are people who think of China as having this very long-term view, and they think in centuries and things like that. I don't look at China that way at all. I mean, I think that what is striking is you first had Mao with his fairly bizarre foreign policy and domestic policy, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. He drove China into the ground. Then you had Deng Xiaoping, this remarkably enlightened opening of China to the world. Now you have Xi Jinping going backwards again. China, you see what I'm saying? There have been lots of course corrections. Maybe there will be another one, but there are no signs of it right now. On your other question, look, we know what's striking about the world right now is in China and Russia and America, you have had these populist nationalists, because I would put Xi Jinping in the same category in some ways. But in a lot of other countries, you have had very spirited, effective, liberal Democrats who have been running their countries very well. I'm thinking of, everywhere from Canada to New Zealand. You have in Germany an extraordinary woman who is now one of the longest serving chancellors in German history, who has been utterly committed to liberalism and democracy. In France, you found a man in Macron who has found a way to thread the needle by being, both dynamic, forward-looking, and at the same time maintain a certain degree of popular support. Not overwhelming, but in France, generally speaking, if you can get to 40% approval rating in France, you're a national hero. It's a very, very difficult country with many divisions. So I actually think there are a lot of, there's a lot of good news in the world. I think that people tend to focus, that's the nature of the beast. You tend to focus on the things that are going wrong. But I think there are a lot of places where things are going right. And by the way, I think one would have to say that Biden is really the man for the hour. If you're looking for somebody who can reconcile, who can heal, who can bring the country together, who can place, just good, competent people in government. If you look at his cabinet, by and large, these are overwhelmingly people of very high quality, very high degree of competence, but not particularly ideological. So I suspect what we will see, even in the United States, is a period of good governance that will surprise on the upside, just as, unfortunately, Trump surprised on the downside.
Mr. Ashok Khemka, Principal Secretary of the Government of Haryana, and then Mr. V.N. Dalmia. If I can please ask you to keep your questions short. Fareed's been very generous. We're well over time. Mr. Khemka?
Yes, Fareed, very lucid articulation by you, but my question is more on the domestic front. we are witnessing an unprecedented farmers' agitation around the national capital. My question is that when just two Indian corporate groups can get away with swindling amounts equal to the annual incomes of nearly 8 million Indians, what do you think is the present farmers' agitation against the new farm laws more an expression of corporate mistrust or misgovernance?
Thank you. If I can just take another question before you answer for it from Mr. V.N. Dalmia. Mr. Dalmia?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, Fareed, is a little disruption bad for America? Was it becoming too set and established in its ways, too fat and complacent, too flabby and prosperous? America has this amazing ability to regenerate itself. It happened in the 70s, and then Reagan came along. So right now, is this a time when American society is reinventing itself and being spurred along by this disruption? Perhaps these disruptions will encourage popular support for gun control and electoral reform.
Should I take those?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
So first on the farmers' agitation, look, I think the answer to your question is it is both, I think. Agriculture in India has been mismanaged from the start. I mean, I think the very fact that agriculture is protected in the Constitution is obviously a mistake. It prevents the dynamic process of resorting that must take place in every economy. Look, one of the reasons India has not grown as much and industrialized as much and modernized as much as China is that the classical pattern of industrialization that takes place is that peasants move from the farms to the cities, they move from farms to factories, and that process has been in many ways blocked by the fact that the Indian government constitution structure has frozen the agricultural sector in a kind of perpetual state of dependence. So, you know, at this point, the problem is when you have a problem that's been festering for so long, any kind of change is going to produce convulsions. And so I have a certain amount of sympathy for the government for, you know, they're trying to make reforms finally, but it's just very hard because you have left this problem unattended and frankly allowed it to exacerbate for so long. But there is this other challenge that you talk about, which is very important to understand, which is the degree of mistrust that is being created by the corruption that you see. And in my opinion, this is fundamentally all about the insistence that the government has on maintaining so much control over the economy, principally through the finance sector. You know, if there's this show on Netflix right now about Indian billionaires, and it's all about the bad boys, you know, the Vijay Dalmias and things like that. And what's striking about the show is in every case, what you have happen is some Indian businessman finds a way to expropriate, swindle vast amounts of money, billions of dollars, thousands and thousands of crores of rupees from government-owned banks, because the government-owned banks are ripe for picking. You have these low-salaried employees who are running these banks, sitting on 75% of the savings of the Indian people, and they milk these and that's how they manage to make themselves multi-billionaires. You know, the fundamental question one says is, why do we need these government banks? Why? What is the purpose served by these banks other than to allow government to exercise patronage power and as an open invitation to this kind of corruption? So I think that part of it is a very important piece as well. Now, what was the second question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Mr. Dalmia was asking about is this a good time for disruption in US?
Oh, right. Look, it's a very important point. I would say, you're 100% right, but I think that the main wake-up call that has come to the United States, and it's one that I think, frankly, will need to come to other countries as well, including India, is we are moving into a world where, if left unattended, you are going to have 10, 15, 20% of the population generate huge amounts of economic wealth, huge amounts of dynamism, huge amounts of innovation, and 20 or 30% of the country will simply be absolutely left behind, and there'll be some group in the middle. That this cannot be a viable, say, social safety system. A lot of what you're seeing in the United States is this deep backlash that is being produced by people who feel as though their world is disappearing. Part of it, by the way, is cultural and racial, but part of it is economic. And when you have that reality, it is very hard to find a way to make the country come together. So this is the wake-up call for the United States. The United States has found a way to be super productive and super dynamic, invent the future. That is continuing to happen, by the way. If you want to look at any of the major fields of innovation, from nanotech to biotech, it's the US that's dominating. But the question becomes, how do you bring the whole country together? How do you make, how do you not have a situation where just 10% is moving forward, 20% is moving forward, and the rest are being left behind? The United States has to grapple with this, but the United States' present is everybody else's future. You are going to see the same dynamic in every country, and every country is going to have to figure out what is their answer to making this, and you cannot end up in a situation where you have that degree of difference, not just in sheer inequality, but in dynamism, in the trajectory forward. Because when people feel that their world is disappearing, they have nothing to lose. And that's what you were seeing on Capitol Hill, I think. That people who felt their world was disappearing and felt they had nothing to lose.
All right, can I take one last question, or am I completely out of time with you?
Let's do one last. I have a board meeting.
So I'll take one last question. Yeah. Mr. C. Rajkumar, the Vice Chancellor of the OP Jindal University. So please go ahead.
Hi, Fareed. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Quick question. Fareed, one of the things that a federal constitutional framework such as the United States is struggling is that a lot of things that happen in different parts of the United States is somewhat completely...
I think we lost him.
Did we just lose you, Dr. Rajkumar? Did you accidentally go on mute in the middle of your question? Okay. Okay. Well, I guess he had raised his hand a while ago. I didn't catch enough for trying to get what he was trying to get at. Did you?
No, I didn't either.
Okay. All right. All right. I think
he has an audio issue. He's still talking clearly, but we can't hear him, unfortunately.
Oh, that's too bad. Okay, I think Fareed, you've been so generous with your time. I'm so grateful for it. And I'm so grateful for this book. It's really been, there are very few people who can think as 360 as you can. You've got, you talk social, cultural, economic, political, you have knowledge of all these areas in every region across the country at all different times, at all different time periods. It's really, it's an incredible read, and it's just such a pleasure to be interacting with you. So thank you so much for your time, and ladies and gentlemen, look forward to seeing all of you again on the next Adda.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Express again, and thanks, Anand.
All right. Good evening. Thank you.
Vandita, you can sign out as well, please, if you want to.